My wife's been bugging me about fixing our screen door since last winter. It doesn't quite close all the way, and the aluminum protector for the screen is coming apart and coming off, and the screen is loose and has a hole in it. So I'm finally getting around to working on this project. The first thing to do is to take the screen door off and take it down to the shop. Now there was paint in the screws, but once I dug that out, they came out just fine. It's a little bit tricky because there's a spring in the hinge, so as the hinge comes off, it closes. Our whole front entryway needs to be fixed up, not just the door. This is an extra wide door. It's four feet wide. So I could take the door out to the shop and work on it there. That would be a lot easier. So now that it's in the shop, I can break the door down, sort of demo it down to just what I need to work on. So one of the main things that needs to get fixed is this metal thing that I guess protects the screen. Is kind of coming apart and it doesn't look very good. So what I think I want to do is just remove it and build a wooden version of this thing. Taking the screen protector off wasn't too hard. It was just a few screws holding it in place. And once I got the screws out, it's sort of funny that it's not a complete piece. It's just a bunch of parts that kind of came apart. And then there's a hole kind of near the handle in the screen, and the screen's kind of loose. So now I can take the screen off. And I was playing detective at this point, trying to figure out how the screen was attached so that I could put it back on again the same way. And it appeared there's a piece of trim over the edge of the screen, and then the screen is just stapled in place. So I carefully took the trim off. I was thinking at this point that I might save it and reuse it, so I was being careful not to damage it. But in the end, I made new pieces of trim. Then once the trim was off, I could take the staples out, which wasn't hard. There was just a lot of them, because there was one every maybe 2 inches. And I was being careful with this, not so much to save the staples or the screen, but just not to damage the door. I got that off. That came off pretty easily. And there were a few little brad nails left over from the trim. Didn't come out with the trim. And one corner of the door frame was starting to come apart. So I stuffed some glue in there and kind of put it back together. And it actually worked pretty well. And just a piece of tape to hold it in place while the glue sets up. And a piece of wood clamp just to keep it all flat. Now for the new screen protector, which would sort of be the design for the door, we came up with a bunch of ideas, but I ended up doing something fairly simple and at the size of the original screen protector, where I would just make some horizontal wood slats and then put some starbursts on that. So what I need to make are some wood sticks, basically. And I thought with the dark brown of our house and our dark floor and the red of the door, that if I used walnut, it would work with the color. So I got some walnut ready to cut into strips. I cut it into strips. And then cut those strips to length. Now the vertical pieces needed some dados cut in them. So the dados then make a spot for the horizontal pieces to fit into the vertical sides. And I can just glue those into place. And some pin nails to hold it together. And I still put clamps on it. Now I can build the starbursts that'll fit on that frame. So I needed to make the hub in the center of the starburst. So what I did is made a little ring of segments. Now if you do 12 segments with this kind of sled, you can use a 30-degree triangle to find the angle, and it works perfectly. And the segments go really quickly now with this sled setup. And I can glue them together. With the sled and the 30-degree triangle, they go together perfectly without any gap. And I'll flatten them with the hammer. Then they can dry. And I can take them out. When I started to think about it, I needed to hold this on the lathe to turn it. And I didn't want to have the chuck holding the segmented piece, so I glued a smaller circle to the back of the segmented piece. And that's what the chuck can hold on to. And that lets the segmented ring sort of float in space on the lathe, so I can get to the front and the sides without the chuck being in the way. I can smooth and kind of true up the face and the sides and get it nice and round. Then start to find a shape that I wanted to have. And I could sand this. This will be the last chance I have to sand. And I can start to look at how the spokes or the starburst part will work with this. So what I've done in the past when I've done something like this is to drill holes into the hub and then turn the spindles to fit those holes. Then glue the spindles to the hub. So I drilled the holes into the hub, and that was easy enough. But something I've wanted to try is to make the tenon part, the part that's on the spindle, on the CNC machine. I've done it on the lathe, which works, but each tenon on each spindle has to be carefully handmade to fit the hole, and checked and rechecked, and if you go too far and you make it too small, you have to throw that spindle out. So the thought was to make the tenons on the CNC machine to fit the hole of the drill bit perfectly, which would mostly just save a lot of time, because I could make all of my blanks for the spindles really quickly, and they would all fit perfectly into the holes drilled on the lathe. So I got sort of a wide piece of walnut and cut the tenons into that. Then on the table saw I could cut each spindle apart from the wide piece of walnut. So this was the first batch. And the little tenon makes a perfect spot to hold the spindle on the lathe. So it's really quick to put each spindle onto the lathe and start working on it. Now I made a batch that were just cones basically, where the sides are straight and it just goes from the tenon end to the point at the other end. So that's what these are. And then the ends I would just cut off and then sand to a little rounded nose sort of end. Then there's a second batch where I thought the straight cone shape was a little bit boring or a little bit skimpy. So I made a set with sort of a bulge in it. Gives kind of more of a 60s kind of mid-century feel to it. So you can see how the spindles go into the hub. Now I can cut the piece off the back that I used to hold the hub on the lathe with the chuck. And the holes actually helped as finger pockets for doing this, and were actually really helpful. And I can sand off the last little bit so it's perfectly flat. Then I can glue the spindles in. This was pretty straightforward. Just putting a little glue on. It was more a matter of getting the right amount of glue. I kept putting too much and then it would sort of squirt out and get on the hub, which I want a little bit to make sure there's enough glue in there, but not so much that it's getting all over the place. So I have a starburst and let that dry. Now what I want to do is cut this in half and cut out the center that hole will go away now. And that thickness becomes the horizontal piece of the frame. And then I can sand that cut. It sits perfectly flat. Then that gets glued to the frame. I wasn't quite sure how to clamp this or hold it on the frame as the glue dried, so what I ended up doing was putting a little pin nail in on each side, and that worked pretty well. And then once this dried, I sanded the center of the hub where it meets the horizontal piece, so it's all flush. Once that was done, I could put the finish on. And I just used a polyurethane. Now I can reassemble the door. So we're back with the door. I can take the tape off the corner, and that actually worked really well. It's nice and flat. Now the door never closed quite right, and the bottom hit the door sill. So I cut off a little sliver off the bottom, and this actually worked, and it now closes just fine. Now I decided to make new trim for the screen and not use what had been on the door. I thought it would look nicer if it was just a simpler rectangular trim instead of something with the little grooves in it, which you can see here. I'm getting the width for the new trim. Now I can cut each strip. And I can cut them to a rough length and then paint them. And I just used a piece of fur for the trim. Now here's the new screen. I'm not going to do it the way I think most screens are put in now, where you have a groove and a piece of rubber that holds the screen in. I think I'll just do it the way that it was done with the staples holding the screen in place. I haven't really put in screens, so it's not really my thing. So I just did it the way I would do a canvas for painting, where you start in the middle with a staple. Then you start to work your way around the screen, moving out towards the corners on each side, pulling it tight with each staple. And you end up with a tight piece of fabric in the middle. Then I can cut off the extra. And I can put the trim on. So I can miter the corners. And what I found with this, you had a little bit of wiggle room because the inside of the door frame doesn't have to line up perfectly with the trim because the screen is there kind of covering up that view. So as long as you're pretty close with the trim, it works just fine. And I just used some pin nails to hold it in place. Now I can put the little screen protector in. So I just drilled 2 holes on each side, and I used some black drywall screws to hold it in place. And the door's ready to go back. It's always that first screw that's really hard to get in. So I shimmed the bottom up with some window shims, and I had some blocks of wood on it so I could sort of have it held in the right spot while I put the screw in. And it was made a little bit harder because the hinges have springs in them, so you have to hold it open and line the screw up. But after some work, it worked. And we have a new door that closes properly and looks okay. Thanks for watching.